September 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai read the intelligence report twice, then laughed out loud in the humid briefing tent. Sakai had already lost his right eye to American gunners the year before, yet he had flown his crippled fighter more than 500 miles home rather than let the wound kill him. Now, squinting through his one good eye at the page in front of him, he found nothing to fear. The Americans, the report claimed, had built a new fighter nearly twice as heavy as the Zero he trusted with his life, a bomber wearing a fighter's uniform. He told the pilots around him, another failure from a nation that built machines instead of warriors. Outside the tent, his squadron's Zeros sat gleaming on the airstrip, the fighters that had swept the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies without meeting their equal. What Sakai could not have known that morning was that within a year, nearly every pilot standing beside him would be dead, and the clumsy American fighter he was mocking would be the reason why. Historians would later call the coming slaughter one of the most lopsided kill ratios in the history of air combat. The laughter in that tent was about to become the last laugh any of them would ever share. The laughter in the briefing tent at Rabaul did not come from arrogance alone. It came from mathematics that Saburo Sakai had watched prove itself true for nearly 2 years. Sakai was 27 years old that September, a farmer's son from Saga Prefecture who had joined the Navy as a teenager and clawed his way into the cockpit of Japan's finest fighter through years of brutal, unforgiving flight training that washed out 9 of every 10 young men who attempted it. By 1943, he was one of the most experienced pilots in the Pacific, a survivor in a service that measured survival in months, not years. His right eye had been gone for over a year, lost the previous August when a rear gunner aboard an American dive bomber near Guadalcanal put a round through his skull that should have killed him outright. He remembered the moment only in fragments, the sudden white flash behind his eyes, the taste of blood filling his mouth and throat, the cold clarity of understanding that half his vision was gone and would never return, half-blind, blading, and drifting in and out of consciousness for stretches of the flight he could never fully account for afterward. Sakai had somehow flown his crippled Zero more than 500 miles back to base rather than surrender to the sea below. He navigated by memory and by the sun, correcting course each time he blacked out and woke again to find the aircraft still, impossibly flying straight. The story had already become legend among Japanese naval aviators, retold in briefing tents from Rabaul to Truk as proof of what will and discipline could overcome. It was also, though few of them understood this, yet a preview of the stubbornness that would carry Japan's Air Force into a catastrophe of its own making, a willingness to trust the spirit of the pilot over the substance of the machine long after that trust had stopped being rewarded. For 2 years, that stubbornness had been rewarded. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the aircraft Sakai trusted with the remainder of his life, had rewritten the rules of naval aviation from the moment the war began. Over Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft had savaged the American battle fleet while losing only a handful of their own. Over the Philippines that same month, Japanese fighters shredded American air power on the ground and in the sky at a ratio that seemed almost unfair. British Hurricanes over Singapore, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes over Java, American Curtiss P-40 Warhawks scattered across the Pacific. All of them had gone down before the Zero's guns in numbers that embarrassed their pilots and their nations. The aircraft could outturn anything in the sky, climb faster than machines half its size should have allowed, and reach targets more than 1,000 miles from its carrier and still fight when it arrived. The secret was sacrifice. Mitsubishi's engineers, led by a young designer named Jiro Horikoshi, had built the Zero around a simple, ruthless principle. Every pound not spent on speed range, or maneuverability was a pound wasted. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's seat. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks to stop a punctured tank from turning into a fireball. Even the radio was frequently stripped out to save weight, leaving pilots to coordinate with hand signals and wing waggles the way birds might. What remained was an airframe built from a classified aluminum alloy engineers called extra super duralumin, nearly a third lighter than comparable American designs, wrapped around a pilot who was expected to survive through skill alone rather than steel. For a nation that had spent a decade training a small, elite corps of naval aviators to a standard the rest of the world could not match. This trade seemed less like a gamble than simple common sense. The best pilots in Asia did not need armor. They needed to never be hit at all. Half a world away, in a stretch of Long Island farmland turned into an aircraft factory. A very different philosophy was being forced into existence by grief. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had spent the first year of the war building the F6F Wildcat, a stubby, tough little fighter that American pilots flew into battle against the Zero and, more often than any of them wanted to admit, lost. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, and again at Midway 1 month later, Wildcat pilots discovered firsthand what Sakai and his comrades already knew. In a turning fight against a lighter, more nimble opponent, the American fighter simply could not compete. Squadron after squadron returned to their carriers. When they returned at all, with reports that read the same way: enemy fighter out turned us, enemy fighter out climbed us. We survived because the Wildcat could absorb punishment. The Zero could not because we could match it in the air. That single advantage, survivability, became an obsession for the men designing Grumman's next fighter. Lieutenant Commander John Tatch, a Wildcat squadron leader who had already invented a defensive weave tactic just to keep his pilots alive against superior Zeros, spent hours describing combat conditions to Grumman's engineers, sketching the geometry of a dogfight on scraps of paper the way a surgeon might describe an operation. Returning pilots were debriefed not just on tactics, but on the precise sequence of a Zero's attack. The angle of approach, the range at which its guns opened fire, the sound, a .50 caliber round made passing through unprotected aluminum, the way its rounds could turn an unprotected fuel tank into a coffin in seconds. Many of those pilots were barely in their 20s, exhausted men fresh off a carrier deck, describing the deaths of friends to engineers in wool suits who had never once left the ground in anger. Grumman's designers, led by Bill Schwendler, took that testimony and built it directly into an airframe, already taking shape on their drafting tables, treating every debriefing report as a blueprint written in the language of loss. The result, designated the F6F and quickly nicknamed the Hellcat, first flew in June of 1942, months before any Japanese engineer had reason to suspect its existence. The Hellcat that emerged from Bethpage bore almost no resemblance to the philosophy that had produced the Zero. It weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly twice the Zero's weight, and every one of those extra pounds had a purpose. Roughly 200 pounds of armor plate shielded the pilot's back and had more protected the oil system, the component most likely to fail, and doom both aircraft and man if struck. Self-sealing fuel tanks, built from layers of rubber that would swell shut around a bullet hole rather than spill fuel into the fuselage, replaced the bare metal tanks that had turned so many American aircraft into funeral pyres. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, twice the firepower of the Zero's cannon and machine gun combination, were mounted in wings strong enough to carry the weight without flexing. Beneath the cowling sat a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sake engine. An industrial heart built not for elegance, but for raw, dependable power. None of this made the Hellcat graceful. It could not outturn a zero, and no amount of engineering was going to change that basic fact of physics. What it could do was climb faster, die Feste, absorb more punishment, and put a pilot back on his carrier deck alive after a mistake that would have killed him in a lighter aircraft. Grumman's test pilots, flying the prototype through its paces at Bethpage, reported an airplane that felt heavy and honest, an aircraft that forgave the kind of errors young, half-trained pilots were bound to make under fire. It was, in the words of one engineer, a fighter built for the pilots America actually had, rather than the pilots Japan wished every nation could produce. By early 1943, the first production Hellcats were rolling off the Bethpage assembly line and into the hands of Navy fighter squadrons training in Rhode Island and Florida. American pilots arriving from flight school brought nowhere near the polish of a career Japanese naval aviator like Sakai. But they arrived in far greater numbers, with far more fuel to practice, and into cockpits designed to keep them alive long enough to learn. Word of the new fighter reached Japanese intelligence circles slowly, filtered through neutral sources and fragmentary reports, arriving on desks at Rabaul and Truk as little more than a paragraph of specifications that seemed, on paper, absurd. A fighter that heavy officers reasoned could not possibly outfly a zero. It had to be another failure. Another example of an industrial nation trying to substitute machinery for the discipline and sacrifice that had built Japan's air supremacy in the first place. That paper dossier of specifications, dry and unconfirmed by any real encounter, was the report Sakai read in his tent that September morning, and it was the reason he laughed. He had spent 2 years watching heavier, less nimble aircraft fall out of the sky in front of his guns. He had no reason yet to believe this one would be any different, and every reason, drawn from hard experience, to believe it would not be. Around him the tent smelled of damp canvas and engine oil, the air thick with the humidity that never quite lifted from Rabaul even before the sun cleared the tree line. Younger pilots, some of them barely out of flight school themselves, laughed along with him, repeating his words back in the easy, confident shorthand of men who had never yet been proven wrong. Outside the tent, his squadron's Zeros sat gleaming under the tropical sun, their thin aluminum skins catching the light. The aircraft that had made men like him legends and had, for 2 years, given every one of them reason to believe that legend would simply go on repeating itself. Sakai folded the report, set it aside, and went to prepare for the day's patrol, his mind already elsewhere, on fuel, loads, and formation positions, rather than on a paragraph of numbers from a fighter he had never seen fly. Somewhere over the ocean between Bethpage and Rabaul, in ways no intelligence report could yet capture, the balance of the Pacific Air War had already begun to shift, and it was shifting toward the very fighter he had just dismissed as another American failure. A different kind of report, this one describing an actual encounter rather than a page of specifications, had already reached Rabaul on the last day of August, 1943, and it was easy, at first, to dismiss as noise. Carrier aircraft had struck Marcus Island, a lonely speck of coral more than 1,000 miles from Tokyo, and among the attacking formations, Japanese lookouts had spotted an unfamiliar silhouette, bulkier than a Wildcat, faster than anything American carriers had launched before. The strike had come and gone in hours, a hit-and-run raid of the kind the Americans had been running for months. usually fleeing before Japanese fighters could rise to meet them in strength. Marcus had few fighters to spare that day, and the new American aircraft returned to its carrier, having done little more than announce, quietly, that it existed. Sakai heard about it secondhand, in the kind of clipped, unremarkable phrasing officers used to describe events that had not yet cost anyone anything. A new fighter had appeared over Marcus Island. It had not been tested. Nobody in the tent thought much more about it, and for good reason. In 2 years of war, dozens of rumored wonder weapons had crossed the desks of Japanese intelligence officers, and almost all of them had turned out to be exaggerations. Misidentifications, or simple propaganda meant to reassure a nervous American public that help was on the way. There was no particular reason on the last day of August to believe this report would be any different from the others that had come and gone without consequence. Wake Island, roughly 5 weeks later, was different. On the 5th and 6th of October, American carrier aircraft returned in force to Wake, and this time the Japanese fighters based there rose to meet them in real numbers, flying the same tactics that had won them every major engagement of the war so far. Climb above the enemy, dive in fast, use the Zero's turning radius tighter than anything the Americans could match, to slide onto an opponent's tail before he knew the fight had started. It was a formula that had worked against Hurricanes, against Buffaloes, against Wildcats, against nearly every fighter the Allies had thrown into the Pacific for 2 years, running over Wake. For the first time, it did not work at all. The new American fighter, now confirmed as the Grumman F6F Hellcat, refused to fight the fight. It was supposed to lose. When Zeros dove on American formations, expecting them to scatter or twist into defensive turns, the Hellcats instead held formation and kept diving, trading altitude for speed the way the Zero's lighter, draggier airframe never could. When the range closed, the Hellcats fired in short, disciplined bursts and then did something no Japanese pilot had trained to counter. They climbed away, using an engine nearly twice as powerful as the Zero's to simply outrun any attempt at pursuit, resetting the fight from a position of advantage rather than grinding through a turning duel. The Zero was built to win. One division of Japanese fighters over Wake tried the only response their training offered, throwing their aircraft into ever tighter turns in an attempt to force the Hellcats to follow, to drag the fight down into the one arena where the Zero's advantage remained absolute. The Hellcats simply declined. They broke off, climbed back to altitude in wide, unhurried circles, and waited for the Zeros to exhaust the fuel and the airspeed. A hard-turning fight burned away in minutes, then came down again in another slashing pass, the same sequence repeating itself until the Japanese formation, low on fuel and scattered across the sky, had no choice but to break for home. It was, as surviving flight leaders would later describe it, less like combat between equals and more like watching a heavier, more patient predator herd its prey, rather than chase it. A shift in the basic character of aerial combat that no amount of individual skill could fully offset. Japanese pilots returning to Rabaul and Truk that October described an enemy that behaved less like an individual aviator and more like a piece of well-oiled machinery, refusing every invitation to fight fair and finding, again and again, ways to make the encounter unfair in its own favor instead. What none of them yet understood was that this was not improvisation. It was doctrine built more than a year earlier from a single stroke of extraordinary luck. In June of 1942, a Japanese Zero flying off a carrier during the Aleutians campaign suffered engine trouble and crash, landed on the boggy tundra of Akaton Island, off the coast of Alaska. The pilot died in the landing, but the aircraft itself, though damaged, remained largely intact, its secrets sitting undisturbed in the fog and rain for more than a month before an American salvage team finally located it. Half sunk in mud, one wing bent, but the airframe otherwise whole, word of the discovery moved up the chain of command with an urgency few wrecked aircraft ever received, because everyone involved understood immediately what they were looking at. For the first time since the war began, Allied engineers had a chance to study the Zero, not from wreckage scattered across a jungle floor, or from the frightened recollections of pilots who had barely survived an encounter with one, but from an intact, flyable example of the aircraft that had humiliated every air force in the Pacific, shipped south to San Diego, and painstakingly rebuilt over the following weeks. The captured Zero was put through exhaustive flight testing against every American fighter type available, flown to its limits and beyond by test pilots who treated each flight as a kind of interrogation, probing for the aircraft's breaking points, the way an investigator might probe a suspect for a hidden weakness. The results, circulated through the fleet by the end of 1942, amounted to an instruction manual for killing the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. The Zero, American test pilots confirmed, could outturn anything in the American inventory at low and medium speed, exactly as Japanese pilots believed, but its ailerons stiffened and its roll rate collapsed at high speed. Its engine choked and lost power in a sudden dive or a hard push into negative gravity, and its unprotected fuel tanks and unarmored cockpit meant that a single solid burst landed almost anywhere on the airframe was frequently enough to kill it outright. The tactical conclusion, printed and distributed to every American fighter squadron in the Pacific months before the Hellcat ever saw combat, was simple enough to fit on a single page: never, under any circumstances, try to turn with a Zero. Use speed, use altitude, dive, strike, and climb away. Let the Zero's own advantages become irrelevant by refusing to fight on the terms that made them advantages at all. This was the doctrine Hellcat pilots carried into every engagement from Marcus Island onward. And it was the reason Japanese fighters kept encountering an enemy that seemed to know with almost supernatural precision exactly which fights to avoid and exactly when to strike. There was no mystery to it, only preparation, built from a dead man's wrecked airplane and distributed with the same industrial thoroughness that built the Hellcat's engines. By November, the pattern had grown difficult for even the most confident Japanese commanders to explain away. American carrier task forces struck Rabaul itself twice that month, on the 5th and again on the 11th, throwing hundreds of aircraft against the harbor and airfields that had served as Japan's most important base in the South Pacific for nearly 2 years. The same harbor Sakai could see from his own airstrip on a clear morning. Japanese fighters rose in strength both times, flown by pilots who had defended Rabaul through a dozen earlier raids and knew its approaches and its escape routes better than any American pilot possibly could. Men who had grown almost casual about the rhythm of alert sirens and scrambled takeoffs after nearly 2 years of practice. It did not matter. American formations, guided toward incoming Japanese aircraft with an accuracy that seemed to defy explanation, were consistently in position before Japanese formations even completed their climb to altitude, waiting above them at exactly the altitude and bearing that gave away nothing and offered no warning at all. Ground crews at Rabaul, watching the returning Zero's taxi in that afternoon with fewer aircraft than had taken off that morning, had begun to notice a pattern of their own. One, nobody wanted to say aloud in the officers' mess. The raids were no longer close contests decided by skill. They were exchanges in which Japan simply lost more than it could afford to lose. Again and again, month after month. The explanation, again, was not mysticism. It was radar. Mounted aboard American carriers and cruisers and fed into fighter direction centers, where officers tracked incoming raids as small blips of light on a glass screen. Plotting course, speed, and altitude, and then routing that information by voice radio directly into the cockpits of orbiting Hellcat divisions. Inside those darkened compartments below deck, young officers hunched over radar scopes for hours at a stretch, translating flickers of green light into spoken vectors, a steady, unhurried voice in a pilot's headset calling out bearings and altitudes the way a traffic controller might guide aircraft through fog. It was tedious, exhausting work, and it was also, in its own quiet way, as decisive as anything happening in the sky above. A Japanese strike could be detected 50 miles or more from its target, tracked continuously as it closed the distance, and met by fighters vectored to precisely the right altitude and bearing to achieve surprise rather than suffer it. Japanese pilots, trained from their earliest days to rely on trained eyesight and squadron discipline to spot an approaching enemy, found themselves fighting blind against an opponent who never was. As pilots who survived those interceptions near Rabaul that November would later describe it, the experience needed no elaboration. We were climbing through cloud when they found us. No warning, no visual contact before the guns opened. They already knew our course. Our altitude, our formation. We were fighting men who could see in the dark while we groped forward in daylight. Beneath the tactics and the technology lay a third crisis, quieter than either, but ultimately more decisive. And it was one the Imperial Navy had inflicted almost entirely upon itself. Before the war, Japan's naval pilot training program had been, by any honest measure, the most demanding in the world, stretching across nearly 3 years and producing aviators who entered combat with roughly 700 hours in the air, alongside a depth of gunnery and formation practice that made men like Sakai genuine masters of their craft before they ever fired a shot in anger. It was a system built on the same philosophy that had shaped the Zero itself, an unshakable faith that quality, patiently cultivated, would always outweigh quantity hurried into existence. That system had been built to produce a small, elite force, and it had never been designed to replace losses on the scale the Pacific War was now inflicting. As 1943 wore into 1944, veteran instructors were pulled from training schools and thrown into frontline squadrons to cover the widening gaps left by the dead. Fuel grew scarce enough that basic maneuvers were increasingly practiced in unpowered gliders rather than aircraft with engines. And ammunition allotted for live gunnery practice shrank to a fraction of pre-war levels. Pilots, who might once have trained for years before their first combat sortie, were now reaching frontline squadrons with a few hundred hours of flight time, some considerably less, many having fired their guns in the air only a handful of times before facing an enemy who had trained for months in relative safety over the plains of Texas and Florida. American pilots arriving in the Pacific by 1944 were, by comparison, still relatively inexperienced next to a pre-war Japanese ace, but they arrived in far greater numbers, with far more hours logged, more ammunition expended in practice, and cockpits built as the Hellcat's own design history made plain, specifically to forgive the kind of mistakes inexperienced pilots were bound to make under fire. Training officers at the Naval Air Station, still turning out Japanese pilots that year, put the arithmetic more bluntly than any official report cared to, describing young ensigns arriving at the front who had never once fired their guns in the air, because there was no fuel and no ammunition left to spare for men who were only going to fly a handful of missions in any case. Many had never flown at night. Many had never practiced against another aircraft in a real dogfight. They were, in every sense that mattered, still students, and they were being sent to fight men who had spent a year training for exactly this moment. The gap in raw individual skill that had defined the war's opening year was narrowing every month, not because Japanese pilots were improving, but because the men now filling their cockpits were, on average, barely more than children, with a few months of hurried instruction behind them. The gap in numbers, fuel, and training capacity was doing the opposite, widening into something no amount of individual heroism, however genuine, could close. All of these threads, tactics born from a dead man's wrecked zero radar that let American pilots see what Japanese pilots could not, and a training system collapsing under the weight of its own attrition, converged with terrible clarity on the 19th of June, 1944. In the waters of the Philippine Sea, Japan committed nearly everything that remained of its carrier air power to the battle. 9 carriers, launching roughly 450 aircraft in a series of coordinated strikes meant to break the American fleet in a single decisive engagement, the kind of victory the Imperial Navy had been chasing since the loss of 4 carriers at Midway 2 years earlier. Waiting for them was Task Force 58, 15 carriers strong, carrying more than 900 aircraft, close to half of them Hellcats, all of them warned well in advance by radar that tracked the first Japanese strike wave from more than 150 miles out. American fighters were airborne, positioned at altitude with the sun at their backs. Long before the first Japanese aircraft came within sight of the fleet they were meant to destroy. Among the American squadrons scrambling into the sky that morning was Air Group 15, flying from the carrier Essex, under the command of a 34-year-old officer named David McCampbell. McCampbell had spent years as a fleet aviator before the war, flying biplanes off the deck of an early American carrier long before anyone in Washington seriously imagined an aircraft like the Hellcat would ever be needed. And that decade of accumulated experience showed in a flying style built on patience rather than nerve. He brought to the fight over the Philippine Sea a discipline that younger pilots, still burning with the desire to prove themselves in a single, reckless pass, often lacked. He did not believe in chasing a fight the enemy wanted to give him. He believed in making the enemy fight the battle. The Hellcat was built to win, climbing for altitude, waiting for position, and only then committing to the attack. The same doctrine written 2 years earlier from the wreck on Akutan Island, now practiced by a man experienced enough to execute it with something close to precision. What followed across the day was less a battle than a demonstration. Japanese fighter escorts, still flying the same doctrine that had ruled the skies in 1942, attempted to engage Hellcats stacked above them at every altitude from 20,000 feet upward. A formation one surviving Japanese officer later described as standing like a wall of steel across the sky before the fighting even began. American pilots refused to turn and fight. They dove, fired, and climbed away, over and over, picking apart Japanese formations that had no answer for an enemy who would not stay still long enough to be outturned. Of the roughly 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike wave, more than 40 were shot down before ever reaching the American fleet. Successive waves fared little better, arriving in smaller, more ragged formations as fuel and aircraft losses mounted through the afternoon. Each wave meeting the same wall of Hellcats climbing to intercept it long before it reached visual range of the ships below. McCampbell himself added several confirmed kills to his growing tally that day. Flying with the same unhurried discipline he preached to the younger pilots under his command, refusing to press an attack until the odds were entirely in his favor and then closing without hesitation once they were. By the end of the day, Japan had lost roughly 340 aircraft to every cause, the overwhelming majority of them in the air, while American losses from all combat that day numbered only a few dozen. American pilots, gathering in their ready rooms that evening to compare notes over cups of coffee, coined a phrase for what they had just witnessed, one that would follow the battle into every history written about it after. They called it a turkey shoot, because the Japanese aircraft, for all the courage of the men flying them, had proven every bit as helpless as game birds flushed into open sky. It was a phrase built for a headline, blunt and almost cruel in its simplicity, and it would prove, over the following 4 months, to be less an exaggeration than a preview of what remained of Japan's naval air power still had coming. A warning that almost nobody left alive in the Imperial Navy's carrier squadrons was yet in a position to heed. At Rabaul, and later from a training post in Japan where he had been reassigned to pass on what remained of his hard-won experience to pilots who would never come close to matching it, Sakai received the news of the Philippine Sea in fragments the way most Japanese officers did, official casualty figures arriving weeks after the truth had already spread by rumor through every mess hall and briefing tent in the fleet. He did not need the official numbers to understand what had happened. He had watched the pieces assemble themselves for nearly a year. The strange, heavy fighter that refused to turn and fight fair. The interceptions that arrived with impossible precision. The replacement pilots reaching his own training squadrons with fewer hours and less confidence with each passing month. Standing in front of a classroom of teenage cadets who addressed him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for men twice his age. Sakai found it increasingly difficult to teach the tactics that had once made him one of the finest pilots in the Pacific. Knowing now that the enemy those boys would eventually face had already written a countermeasure for nearly everything he had to offer, he kept teaching anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. And because the alternative, telling frightened 19-year-olds that the war in the air was already effectively lost before they had ever climbed into a cockpit, was not a truth, any officer in his position was permitted to speak aloud. The aircraft he had laughed at in September of the previous year had not simply proven itself equal to the zero, it had proven itself the instrument of something far larger, an entire industrial nation's capacity to outbuild, outtrain, and outproduce an enemy that had once seemed unbeatable in the air, and there was no longer any way to pretend otherwise. What remained to be seen in the months ahead was just how far that reckoning would be allowed to go, and what Japan's Naval Air Service, having already spent its finest pilots and its most capable aircraft in exchange for so little, would be willing to sacrifice next in order to postpone an ending its own officers could now see coming with mathematical clarity. By October of 1944, Japan had almost nothing left to lose, and threw what remained of it at the Americans anyway. In the middle of the month, over the waters near Formosa, Japanese pilots launched wave after wave of attacks against the approaching American fleet, returning to base with claims of carriers and battleships sunk in numbers that, for one brief and desperate moment, were broadcast across Japan as a war-winning victory. The claims were almost entirely false, inflated by exhausted pilots flying through smoke and anti-aircraft fire who genuinely believed, in the chaos of the moment, that they had struck a decisive blow. The true cost only became clear afterward, when the surviving aircraft were counted and the surviving pilots debriefed. Japan had lost several hundred aircraft over Formosa. Along with most of the last trained pilots, the home islands had left to send the American fleet they had claimed to cripple, sailed on toward the Philippines almost entirely undamaged. 8 days later, on the 24th of October, what remained of that fleet arrived off Leyte Gulf, and David McCampbell was waiting above it, leading a flight of just 7 Hellcats from the carrier Essex. McCampbell intercepted a Japanese formation of roughly 60 aircraft, a mix of fighters and bombers making for the American ships below. By any reasonable calculation, the odds favored the defenders overwhelmingly. 8 Japanese aircraft for every American fighter in the sky. The kind of arithmetic that a year earlier might have argued for breaking off and waiting for help to arrive, McCampbell did not retreat and did not wait for reinforcements, applying the same doctrine he had practiced over the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier. Patience, altitude, and a refusal to be drawn into a fight on the enemy's terms, he led his small formation into the much larger one and began methodically to take it apart, climbing above the Japanese formation first to choose the moment and angle of every attack rather than let the enemy's numbers dictate the terms of the fight. Over the course of roughly 90 minutes, McCampbell personally shot down 9 Japanese aircraft of mixed types, a total that stood after the war as the single greatest number of aerial victories credited to one American pilot in one mission. His wingman that day, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 6 more between them in less than 2 hours. They accounted for 15 enemy aircraft without either man taking a single hit in return. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill. McCampbell reported afterward, with the same understated calm he brought to every account of that day, the action earned him the Medal of Honor, the highest award the United States military can bestow, and it stood as perhaps the clearest single demonstration of everything the Hellcat and the doctrine built around it had been designed to achieve for Japan's naval command. Watching results like these arrive from every front, conventional air combat had become a mathematics problem with no solution left to find. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly arrived to take command of what remained of Japanese naval air power in the Philippines, reached a conclusion that October, which would have been unthinkable to the confident young pilots gathered in Sakai's briefing tent barely a year earlier. If a Zero attacked an American carrier using conventional tactics, Onishi calculated its chance of scoring a hit through the wall of anti-aircraft fire and defending Hellcats was close to nothing. If the same aircraft was flown deliberately into its target, sacrificing the pilot in exchange for near certainty of impact, the odds of success rose dramatically. The pilot would very likely die in either case. Onishi's arithmetic simply proposed making that death count for something. The first officially organized Kamikaze mission, launched on the 25th of October, 1944, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, striking American escort carriers off Leyte Gulf and marking the beginning of a campaign that would eventually send well over 1,000 Japanese pilots to their deaths in deliberate suicide attacks before the war's end. It was, in every sense, an admission of defeat dressed in the language of sacrifice, a final surrender of the idea that Japanese pilots could still win the air war through skill alone, replaced by the grim calculation that only their deaths retained any tactical value at all. Among the pilots who flew escort for that first mission was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, credited by many of his fellow aviators as the finest fighter pilot Japan produced during the entire war, a quiet, almost withdrawn man whose skill in the cockpit stood in sharp contrast to his reserved manner on the ground. Fellow pilots who served alongside him described a man who rarely spoke at meals and kept to himself between missions, transformed the moment he climbed into a cockpit into something closer to an instrument than a man, capable of maneuvers other pilots considered nearly impossible in a Zero even at that late stage of the war. Nishizawa's confirmed total of aerial victories remains disputed among historians to this day, since so many Japanese wartime records were destroyed in the war's final months. But even conservative estimates place him among the deadliest pilots to fly in the Pacific. On the 25th of October, escorting Seki's mission toward the American fleet, Nishizawa was credited with shooting down 2 more Hellcats himself, adding what would prove to be the final victories of his career to an already formidable record. Proof that individual brilliance had not entirely vanished from Japanese naval aviation even as the wider war around it collapsed. The following day, the 26th of October, Nishizawa boarded a transport aircraft as a passenger, unarmed and without a fighter of his own. traveling to collect replacement aircraft for his depleted squadron, somewhere over the Philippines, American fighters intercepted the transport and shot it down, killing everyone aboard. The exact details of that final flight, which American squadron made the intercept, and precisely how the encounter unfolded were never fully documented on either side. But the broader outline is not seriously disputed by historians. Japan's greatest fighter pilot, a man who had personally shot down 2 Hellcats less than 24 hours earlier, died as a helpless passenger, killed by the very aircraft type he had just briefly defeated without a single gun of his own, to answer with news of Nishizawa's death moved through what remained of Japan's naval aviation like a physical blow. If a pilot of his caliber, one of the very few men left who could still occasionally best a Hellcat in the air, could be killed so easily the moment he was caught without a fighter in his hand, then no amount of individual skill, remaining anywhere in the service, offered any real protection. The lesson, unstated but unmistakable, was that Japan's air war had already been decided by factors no cockpit skill could overcome: industrial capacity, pilot numbers, radar, and doctrine, and that the outcome from this point forward was simply a matter of time. Sakai, training pilots in Japan through the war's final year, lived to see that time run out. He watched replacement pilots arrive at his training squadrons with less and less flight time behind them, some with barely a few dozen hours logged before being sent to units, flying increasingly desperate missions against an enemy that never seemed to run short of aircraft. Fuel, or trained men, many of those boys were younger than Sakai had been when he himself first entered combat, and he found it harder with each passing month to look them in the eye while explaining maneuvers he privately doubted they would ever live long enough to use. He had entered the war, one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the world, flying an aircraft built on the belief that individual mastery could outweigh material disadvantage. He finished it watching that belief collapse in slow motion, squadron by squadron, until almost none of the pilots who had shared that tent at Rabaul in September of 1943 remained alive to remember the laughter, their names known to him only through casualty lists that arrived with grim regularity on his desk by August of 1945, when Japan's surrender finally ended the fighting. The F6F Hellcat had compiled a record that made the mockery of that first September morning almost unbearable to recall. Across the Pacific War, Hellcats destroyed more enemy aircraft in aerial combat than any other Allied fighter type. At a kill ratio, historians still cite as one of the most lopsided of the entire conflict, a figure that would have seemed like fantasy to the pilots who first dismissed the aircraft as a bloated failure over Rabaul 2 years earlier. The aircraft the Japanese intelligence officers had dismissed as an overweight failure had instead become the single greatest instrument of Japan's aerial defeat, not because it outflew the Zero in the way the Zero had once outflown everything else, but because it never needed to. It had been built from the start to win a different kind of war, one measured in armor, numbers, training, and industrial capacity rather than in grace alone. And by the time Japanese naval aviation understood the difference, there was almost nothing left of it to save. Sakai survived the war, one of a small handful of veteran pilots from those early, victorious years who lived to see its end. In the decades that followed, he spoke often about the Zero and the era it represented, an aircraft and a way of fighting that had once made Japan believe it possessed the finest naval air force on earth. He spoke more carefully about the Hellcat, an aircraft he had mocked before he ever saw one in the air and had spent the rest of the war watching prove him wrong in ways no amount of personal skill could answer. The Zero had given Japan 2 years of near total air supremacy, built on the courage and sacrifice of pilots who flew without armor because their nation asked it of them. The Hellcat spent the 2 years that followed proving, with terrible, unhurried patience, exactly what that early confidence had ultimately cost